The Skoptsy sect, a radical Christian movement in Russia, exemplifies one of the most extreme expressions of religious asceticism and mysticism. Emerging around the 1770s, the Skoptsy, or castrated ones, were primarily driven by a belief in purity through bodily sacrifice, particularly self-castration, to eliminate any source of temptation and sin. This group stemmed from a broader tradition of Russian sectarianism, where religious communities, feeling oppressed or disillusioned with the Russian Orthodox Church, pursued alternative spiritual paths. Among these old believers and other dissenters, the Skoptsy stood out for their rigid interpretations and shocking practices that distinguished them as a mystical and fanatical offshoot. The Skoptsy were founded by Kondraty Selivanov, a former peasant who claimed not only to be a new Christ, but also the late Emperor Peter III. Selivanov's doctrine was radical, interpreting the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew about becoming eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven as a literal command. His teachings insisted that sexuality and carnal desires were at the root of all human sin, and by removing one's sexual organs, believers could achieve a state of purity akin to angelic beings, free from worldly desires. Followers revered Selivanov as a prophet and leader, believing that his direct link to the divine gave him insights that could guide them to salvation. This ideology was not simply about physical purity. It was a means of spiritually transcending the material world and escaping human corruption. To perform these self-mutilations, the Skoptsy developed highly secretive rituals, often held in secluded locations like barns or remote homes. Members would gather for ceremonies filled with intense prayer and chanting, where they would commit to the act of sealing their bodies from the mark of the beast, a symbolic term they used to describe human sexuality. The group classified their bodily modifications into two main practices: the small seal and the great seal. The small seal involved the removal of male testes or partial breast removal in females, an act aimed at reducing sexual impulses. The great seal was more extreme, requiring complete genital removal for men and full mastectomies for women. These were regarded as the highest form of sacrifice, the complete eradication of fleshly desires. Due to the gruesome nature of these practices, the Skoptsy operated underground, maintaining secrecy to avoid both public outrage and police intervention. The Russian Orthodox Church and the Tsarist government viewed the Skoptsy as a severe threat to both religious and social order. The Orthodox Church denounced them as heretics, deeming their self-mutilation practices an affront to Christian doctrine, while the state labeled them as subversive. Fearing that the Skoptsy's influence would spread, authorities cracked down on the sect, implementing harsh punishments and public shaming to discourage others from joining. Followers were arrested, exiled to Siberian labor camps, or even committed to mental asylums. This persecution, however, had an unintended effect. It reinforced the Skoptsy's belief in their righteousness and emboldened their faith as they saw themselves as martyrs for a divine cause. The Skoptsy were remarkably organized, with a structured hierarchy and clandestine networks that helped them survive amidst persecution. Their leaders, regarded as apostles or prophets, played key roles in directing the sect's theology and maintaining cohesion among followers. These leaders frequently traveled across rural Russia to gather followers, spread teachings, and perform ceremonies. The Skoptsy's ideology spread particularly among the disenfranchised and rural poor, who were drawn to the promise of spiritual purity and community. In addition to ritual mutilation, the Skoptsy also practiced communal living and shared resources, establishing a way of life that relied on mutual support and isolation from broader Russian society. Despite these challenges, the sect's numbers continued to grow throughout the 19th century, and they spread as far as Siberia, the Ural Mountains, and even Eastern Europe. This expansion worried the Russian government, prompting Tsar Alexander I and subsequent rulers to intensify repression efforts. Undercover agents infiltrated Skoptsy gatherings, and those found practicing or encouraging self-mutilation faced severe penalties, including imprisonment and forced exile. The Russian state's persecution was relentless, often involving brutal methods to suppress the sect. Still, the Skoptsy endured, seeing their persecution as a trial of faith and a sign of their spiritual election. One of the unique aspects of the Skoptsy was their adaptation of Russian folklore, songs, and traditional symbolism into their rituals. The group created hymns and chants that emphasized themes of purity, renunciation, and martyrdom, reflecting their view that earthly suffering would lead to divine reward. These hymns, often filled with biblical references, resonated with rural communities, many of whom were familiar with Orthodox liturgical songs but were disenchanted with mainstream religious practices. By integrating familiar cultural elements into their worship, the Skoptsy were able to connect with potential converts who might have otherwise been wary of their extreme practices. However, as the 19th century progressed, the Skoptsy began to decline in numbers, partly due to the natural limits of their recruitment, since castration prevented biological reproduction, and partly because of increasing state repression. The Russian Empire's intensifying control over religious groups in the late 19th century left little room for the Skoptsy to operate openly. Additionally, as modern ideas of medicine, psychology, and sexuality began to influence Russian society, fewer young people were attracted to the Skoptsy's radical doctrines. Nevertheless, the Skoptsy left an indelible mark on Russian religious history, representing the lengths to which spiritual fervor could push believers, even to the extent of bodily sacrifice. After the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Skoptsy faced one of their greatest challenges: the militant atheism of the Soviet regime. The new government aggressively cracked down on religious organizations, viewing them as remnants of a backward past. The Soviet authorities considered the Skoptsy not only a religious group, but a threat to the ideals of scientific progress and social modernity. Many Skoptsy were sent to labor camps, executed or repressed into silence. By the mid-20th century, the Skoptsy community was nearly extinct, with only a few adherents surviving in isolated regions of Russia and Siberia. Most of their remaining members were elderly, and the younger generations either rejected the practices or were forcibly assimilated by Soviet society. Today, the Skoptsy are largely extinct, remembered primarily through historical records, folklore, and the accounts of Russian ethnographers. Modern scholars and theologians consider the Skoptsy a unique case study in religious psychology and the nature of religious extremism. Their story raises questions about the psychological power of belief, the social conditions that foster radical movements, and the dynamics between state power and religious independence. Historians also see the Skoptsy as part of a broader legacy of Russian mysticism and dissent, which includes other radical groups like the Doukhobors and the Klists. These sects highlight a distinctive feature of Russian spirituality: a willingness among certain groups to embrace sacrifice, suffering, and even death as means of achieving divine connection. In contemporary Russian society, the Skoptsy are sometimes referenced as cautionary examples in discussions on the extremes of faith and the potential dangers of unregulated religious fervor. Their radical beliefs continue to capture the imagination, inspiring everything from academic studies on religious fanaticism to fictional portrayals in literature and film. Though they are no longer an active sect, the Skoptsy's legacy lingers as a historical reminder of the power that faith and conviction can hold over human lives and the lengths to which some will go to reach spiritual transcendence.